This event is important. It marks the end of our 2-year initial period of work on Russia-Africa, which has been really interesting and became much more interesting a year ago when the invasion of Ukraine happened. And we were called on to make commentary, and we've tried to really research this complex relationship between Russia and Africa and see where it's going, look at regional differences and aspects of this important relationship.
South Africa has been a key member of the non-aligned movement and clearly hosted it in 1998. The issue of non-alignment is again at the forefront of discussions in the global south because of Ukraine, and I think Ukraine has brought to the fore and raised to the surface, because I think many of these issues were there to start with, but raised to the surface some of the questions about how developing countries, global south, will have to navigate a world that is very different from the 1990s and the 2000s, where you had one single hegemon. This is now a much more multipolar world.
What we try to do at SAIA is really to bring a number of experts from different parts of the world, and particularly the global south, to reflect on the question, what is non-alignment in 2023? Why does it matter for our countries? And what are some of the recommendations that we can put forward to policymakers globally? We do feel that by doing that, it enables a discussion that does not make us to cling to a concept that is an old concept. We know that non-alignment is something that was originated during the Cold War, but it has a very particular meaning and setting for developing countries right now. And particularly in doing that, we hope to increase the agency and the ability and the leverage that these countries have, not only to influence global politics, but also to ensure they're not being placed as a pawn in fights that are not necessarily ours.
The current global context, where countries are divided, largely due to the war in Ukraine, but also because of some of the other challenges that have drawn us further apart, the manner in which countries have reacted to the COVID-19 pandemic, for example, has resulted in challenges in terms of us being able to reach agreement on key problems that the world faces. We have challenges such as climate change, migration, terrorism, and most importantly, the implementation of the Global Development Agenda. These are challenges that countries need to address by working collaboratively. Countries of the South should, and from our perspective, we should not be drawn into these different poles that have emerged, but instead we should work together towards building trust and be bridge builders to ensure that the global commitments are met.
The world is interested in the position of Africa when it comes to the Russia-Ukraine war. Why will I say so? It's because of that great surprise that the world had during the very first vote, where it looked like the world actually expected Africans to vote in one direction, but then when Africa decided to vote in another direction, raised a whole surprise to the Western countries especially. And I think it's also important because although the conflict is far away from Africa, Africa is actually feeling the impact.
The voting patterns for a number of resolutions now have been divided. They're divided between abstain, which is a significant number, and yes voters, which is also a significant number. What this reveals is that there is a pattern that you see throughout the world, because the votes for the 197 members of the UN are also deeply divided. The 140 are consistently voting for, and a huge other numbers of countries, almost the same as 140, voting to abstain. Africa has the most stark pattern of division, almost into half of the vote. But when you look below the surface and look at all of that, the abstainers and yes voters hold the same position on that. And they use yes or abstain to make the same point. And principally that point is we reject territorial the breach of territorial integrity of Ukraine. We reject that because it is the breach of international law. And that secondly, we think that we should de-escalate the conflict rather than escalate it. And that lastly, we would want to see more dialogue and diplomacy leading to a new agreement.
Countries in the Global South, in Africa, in Asia, and Latin America are being pressured to choose between some of the great powers, and they are not liking it. Much like it was in the case of the 50s and 60s, they want to choose their own path. They want to stand up for their own interest. They don't want to be a plaything of others, as Jawaharlal Nehru famously put it. Now, does that mean that this new non-alignment or active non-alignment, as I refer to it, is simply an addition of the same non-alignment that took place in the 20th century? No, it is not. It takes a page from that, but adapts it to the realities of the new century, one in which there is a very different situation for the Global South. There is something called a New South. There's been a wealth shift from the North Atlantic to the Asia Pacific. The fastest growing region in the world today is Asia.
Well, Russia has had a long-standing problem in terms of overpromising and under-delivering in what it offers to African countries, and that's not unlike what it's done in many other theaters of the Global South. For example, in their relations with the Gulf monarchies, even with Saudi Arabia, they've been keeping a static $10 billion investment target ever since 2015. So this is a chronic problem that's to do with the fact that Russia has obviously got extremely limited economic capabilities. And we're really seeing that in the context of Africa. The Russian trade volumes with sub-Saharan Africa are lower than that of Turkey and only 1/3 that of India, neither of which are countries that you normally would consider to be great powers in Africa. So it's unsurprising that the combined effect of African uncertainties about secondary sanctions and Russia's own limited ability to supply arms because of their use in Ukraine, as well as Russia's own economic contraction, would lead to a substantial stagnation of Russia-Africa economic growth.
Well, I think the original concept of a new international economic order was very much built around the architecture of the 70s. I mean, you saw incredible shifts and pulls and different structural conditions with regard to the oil crisis, the economic challenges that emerged in the 70s. And so the idea of creating the new international economic order also linked in with the fact that you had a dependency relationship, and that dependency relationship then brought out the idea of what a kind of, I wouldn't say a decoupling, but a kind of international economic order that would be much more conducive to the interests and the national economic interests of countries of the Global South, or at the time, countries of the Third World. So I think at the end of the day, we cannot ignore the fact that the intention was really good, but the dynamics of structural conditions and distribution of capabilities and resources didn't work in the favor of the developing world. But it did actually enable countries like India and China, particularly China, to find its space and to move forward. So the challenge, I think, is really the question of whether we can find that renewal or that reconstitution or recalibration of what the intent was of the new international economic order as conceptualized in the 70s.
The global environment is very fluid, and I think over the last several years we've seen the emergence of new groupings, new formations, new alliances even, or not alliances necessarily in the military sense, but certainly new alliances. You know, for South Africa, the BRICS clearly is an important grouping that helps it to advance some of its objectives around global governance reform, but also some of the potential economic, scientific cooperation. The BRICS is not the only avenue grouping where we play. And clearly our involvement in the G20, which is again a result of the recognition that the world was changing, that the single hegemon was no longer the one who could really, and the West could call the shots and things would happen, that you needed to bring in other countries, and hence the G20. I mean, the G20 is also an area where I hope that notwithstanding some of the the tensions and the discussions we've had about the world being divided increasingly into blocks, I think the G20 should be an area and a forum where countries can come together from the global north and the global south, rivals and enemies, to address some of the key global challenges.
South Africa hosting BRICS this year, it's a great opportunity to reiterate these principles of solidarity with the global south, of non-alignment, and what non-alignment should really mean for South Africa. South Africa has a very interesting way of not necessarily talking directly to what its interests are. Although it did release some kind of national interest, I do think that this year with the 2023 SONA, it was such a lost opportunity to really hype up BRICS and to really talk to, well, politically these are our positions. Because non-alignment is a political stance, but neutrality is a legal stance, as we've been talking about today. BRICS doesn't see itself as the only viable alternative, but it is an alternative, to existing global economic regime. So that's how the thinking about BRICS came about, and that's the interesting point of where it starts to snowball and add in terms of how it manifests its agendas. So when you come to how South Africa joined, South Africa wanted to join, like-minded partners, wanted to get a number of tangible benefits out of any kind of partnership as well that you enter into. It's only natural.
Many countries believe that they need to secure their supply chains. So countries think, okay, well, this was also COVID related, but the conflict in terms of fertilizer and agricultural supply has done the same. So it's led to a big food security push. Countries want to be more food secure. They want to have their own means of manufacturing the basics. And at a more macro and global level, it's put pressure on SWIFT. It has put pressure on which currencies that oil might be traded in. A lot of Russian oil is now, not a lot, but some is being sold in renminbi between China and Russia. That process of de-dollarizing oil sales may become a much bigger trend that ultimately has much bigger implications for the role of the US dollar in the world economy. And the pressure on SWIFT has done the same in terms of SWIFT being used to diminish the role of Russia, or Russia being able to use its own foreign currency in the rest of the world.
As we know that the non-aligned movement was established in 1955, that was very much Cold War environment that it operates in. It saw itself as not of part of the superpower rivalry, and it wanted to stay independent. So the era in which it was established meant that for some time during the Cold War, it maintained certain positions. But after the end of the Cold War, of course, those kinds of rivalries changed. The non-aligned movement has been able to adapt, but not as fast as we would have expected such a dynamic and diverse organization to have done. Many organizations, as we know, adapt when the environment adapts. And I think it's also the nature of the non-aligned movement. It does not have a fixed secretariat. It does not have a headquarters, for example. So it means that states pass leadership onto another state, which means that it is almost like a mobile memory of the organization that's established. So I think one way that it can become a better, more adaptable and more relevant organization is to try and get a headquarters where it is established, from where it can conduct its business in order to have a greater voice in the international community.